He spent 3 months explaining why she was wrong for him. Then he stopped explaining and started planning. But first, the winter. Every reason he gave was a wall. Every wall had her face behind it. And the quiet woman at the edge of it all never raised her voice once. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Let us go back to December, to the supper, to the moment a man who owned 40 empty rooms and £11,000 a year sat across from his closest friend and said something so profoundly, magnificently stupid that it deserves to be preserved in amber. Ashford Park in winter was the kind of place that made loneliness look like architecture. 40 bedrooms, not one of them slept in by a guest since the previous spring. A library with 800 volumes and no one to argue about them with. Grounds that stretched across 3 counties and came back to a house where the only sound after 9 o'clock was the ticking of a clock in the West Gallery that no one had remembered to wind properly in 6 months. So it ran 4 minutes slow and made even time feel like it was avoiding the place. Marcus Ashford, 6th Duke of Ashford, 34 years old, tall and broad-shouldered, with dark brown hair swept back from a high forehead and just long enough to curl behind his ears, stood at the centre of all this nothing and called it sufficiency. He had not dined with the same woman twice in 3 years, not since Charlotte. Not since the engagement that had lasted 11 months and ended in 9 words. I have accepted Lord Pressmore. He has 12,000. Scrawled on cream paper and left on his desk like a bill of sale. She had wanted a title. She had found a richer one. And Marcus had learned the lesson wrong, as wounded men always do, that the safest position in the world is wanting nothing that can refuse you. The December supper was a small affair at Bracewell House, hosted by his great-aunt, attended by perhaps 8, and Marcus had been seated, by design he was certain, near enough to the door that he could watch Eleanor Ashwick pass through the hall on her way out. She had been there earlier in the afternoon for her usual work as Dorothea's companion, and was leaving just as the guests arrived, her dove-grey wool dress and cream linen fichu as plain among the silks as a sparrow in a jeweller's window. The brass thimble on its thin ribbon caught the candlelight at her wrist for half a moment. Then she was gone. Lord Henry Cavell, 33, broad and auburn-haired, and leaning against the mantelpiece with the boneless ease of a man who has never once doubted he is welcome anywhere, watched Marcus watch her leave, and waited. Henry was good at waiting. It was the only sophisticated thing about him. She would not suit, Marcus said, unprompted, which is always how a man begins when he is trying to convince himself. Too quiet, too plain, no family of consequence, no conversation that performs for a room. Henry turned his warm brown eyes toward the fire and said absolutely nothing useful, which was the most devastating thing he could have done. A man in my position requires... Marcus stopped, adjusted the heavy gold signet ring on his left little finger, started again. There are expectations. Henry said, and took a drink. That was the whole of his contribution, and it was more than enough. Now, Eleanor Ashwick, 29 years old, 5'3", chestnut hair in a low knot at the nape of her neck, with a few loose wisps at her temples. Grey-green eyes that looked at the world the way a good lock looks at a key. Measuring, precise, admitting nothing that did not fit. She sewed for shillings, actual shillings. 3 and 6 for a hem, 4 and 8 for a bodice lining, and she kept a ledger of every penny in handwriting so small and so exact it looked like a legal document, because to Eleanor it was one. Behind her dead mother's cottage stood an orchard with 4 hives of bees that produced enough honey to sell at the Michaelmas market and enough wax to make the candles she read by at night. 3 mornings a week she walked 2 miles to teach 3 gentlemen's daughters their letters for 6pence a lesson, and she had never once been late, and she had never once been paid on time, and she had never once complained about either fact. She owed nothing. She answered to no one. She had built a life out of wreckage, and it was not a large life, but it was hers, and every nail in it was driven straight. Lady Dorothea Bracewell had found her, or claimed her, or, more accurately, recognized her, the way one recognizes a good piece of furniture under a bad coat of paint. Dorothea was 78, short and stout, silver-white hair pinned beneath a plum velvet cap, pale blue eyes that missed nothing and forgave less. She had hired Eleanor as a companion 3 afternoons a week at the Dower House, paying her a wage that was generous enough to be useful and modest enough to be accepted without injury to anyone's pride. Dorothea understood pride. She had enough of her own to furnish a cathedral. It was on one of these afternoons, a Thursday, the fire low, Marcus arriving unannounced to pay his aunt a visit he had been putting off for 2 weeks, that he paused in the corridor outside the dining room and saw something that would not leave him alone for months. Eleanor was kneeling beside a chair, one of the old mahogany dining chairs, its rear leg cracked along the grain in a way that would have sent it to the floor under any real weight. She had found glue and a clamp from the kitchen. No one had asked her. No one was watching, she thought. Her hands moved with the sureness of someone who has mended 100 broken things, because broken things do not mend themselves, and there is no one else to do it. She set the clamp, wiped the excess glue with her thumb, stood, placed the chair back at the table, pushed it in, and left the room through the far door without a word. No glance around for witnesses, no pause for thanks. Just the work, done, and then gone. Marcus stood alone in the hallway, with the strange weight of what he had just seen pressing against something behind his ribs that he had spent 3 years trying to board shut. Dorothea's voice reached him from the sitting room, dry as old paper, sharp as a new pin. She had not moved from her armchair. One hand rested on the ivory handle of her walking cane. Her head was tilted, listening to something no one else could hear. "You have mistaken recognition for pity, Marcus. They feel quite similar to a man who has forgotten what the first one is." January came in like a closed fist, grey and bitter, and Marcus Ashford did what any man of sense and 34 years and £11,000 a year would do when confronted by an inconvenient feeling. He resolved to crush it under the heel of his polished black riding boot and move on. He had business to attend to, rents to review, a timber contract that wanted renegotiating, and the matter, raised now by his steward, his solicitor, his aunt, and every matron within 40 miles, of a suitable match. Someone vivid, someone who filled a room the way a chandelier fills a room, with light and warmth, and the kind of beauty that announces itself from the doorway. Not someone who mended chairs in silence and left before she could be thanked. Not someone whose grey-green eyes lingered in his memory like smoke he could not wave away. Not Eleanor Ashwick. He was very clear about this, to himself and to anyone who would listen. Which brings us to the man who had to listen most. Lord Henry Cavill, broad, auburn-haired, perpetually leaning against something, had known Marcus since they were boys at school, and he had the particular curse of friendship that requires one to absorb another man's denials without laughing. He managed this about 4 times. The 5th and 6th, his dimple deepened dangerously. But we shall return to Marcus and his determined blindness. First, there is a man you need to meet, and I confess I do not enjoy the introduction. Mr. Gerald Honeycutt, solicitor, 42 years old, 5 feet 9 inches of carefully maintained composure, sandy hair thinning at the crown and combed so flat it looked painted on, pale hazel eyes that watched you the way a cat watches a mouse it is not yet hungry enough to chase. He managed several estates in the county, collecting rents, reviewing debts, arranging leases, and he was, by every outward measure, a reasonable man. Patient, smiling, unfailingly correct in his grammar and his cravat, and his slim silver pocket watch on its chain, which he consulted often, as though your time belonged to him, and he was keeping a generous account of it. He also held the outstanding debts on Eleanor Ashwick's cottage. £14, that was the sum. £14 remaining from her mother's accounts, a figure so small that a man of Honeycutt's income could have written it off between breakfast and his second cup of tea without noticing the loss. He did not write it off. He visited instead. He came on a Tuesday, mid-morning, when the light through Eleanor's kitchen window was thin and grey, and the cottage smelled of tallow and the dried lavender she hung from the beam above the hearth. He wiped his shoes carefully on the stone step, removed his hat, and smiled at her with the kind of warmth that has no warmth in it at all. "Miss Ashwick, I trust the winter has not been unkind." "It has been winter, Mr. Honeycutt. It was not required to be kind." Her chestnut hair was pinned in its low knot, a few wisps loose at her temples, and she did not offer him a chair, because the only good chair, the one she had not mended at someone else's house, was the one she was using, and she would not stand in her own kitchen to make a man like Honeycutt comfortable. He reviewed the figures. He laid them out with precision. £14, 3 shillings, 8pence, as though the 8pence were the thing that mattered. He noted the quarterly interest. He observed, pleasantly, that the cottage roof wanted mending, and that the cost of thatch had risen since autumn. He mentioned, oh so casually, that her situation might be eased by what he called a private arrangement of mutual benefit. "A woman of your qualities," he said, his hands resting flat on her kitchen table, smile never quite reaching those hazel eyes, "need not struggle in this way. There are arrangements, perfectly respectable, perfectly discreet, by which a man of means might provide a measure of comfort. Patronage, Miss Ashwick. Nothing more." Nothing more. as though the word patronage, wrapped in silk and delivered with a solicitor's careful diction, did not mean exactly what it meant, as though she were too poor to understand the purchase being proposed, or too desperate to refuse it. She understood. She understood down to the last syllable, and the brass thimble on its ribbon at her wrist caught the thin light as her hand stilled on the table's edge, and she said nothing. Because sometimes silence is the loudest refusal a woman can offer a man who believes his own decency. Honeycutt left. He always left. That was the trick of him. He never stayed long enough to be accused of anything, never pressed hard enough to leave a visible bruise. He simply visited, and reminded, and suggested, and withdrew, and the weight of each visit accumulated, like snow on a roof that could not bear much more. Meanwhile, at the January assembly in the town hall, candles blazing, fiddles scraping, the cream of the county turning in their best wool and borrowed silk, Marcus danced with two accomplished women. One was the daughter of a baronet, accomplished in French and watercolour. The other was a widow of independent fortune, who laughed like music and whose hand in his felt like precisely nothing. He described Eleanor's faults to Henry over punch, again, unprompted. She is too sharp, too contained. She has no art of making a man feel welcomed. Henry, leaning against the mantel with his battered riding crop tucked under one arm, tilted his auburn head and let his warm, brown eyes rest on Marcus with something approaching mercy. "You have now told me 6 times why she will not do. I wonder how many more times you require before you hear yourself." Marcus said nothing. His gold signet ring caught the candlelight as he turned his glass, and he said nothing at all, which was the most honest thing he had managed in weeks. And Eleanor? Eleanor's world was not assemblies and punch and the question of who filled a room. Eleanor's world was tallow at 4p the pound and thread at 2p the skein, and the exact weight of a honeycomb, 1 pound 3 ounces from the strongest hive, less from the others, and the 3 shillings she earned for a week's sewing that left her fingers stiff and her eyes aching by nightfall. She was not suffering, she was managing. The distinction matters more than I can tell you, because suffering is a thing that happens to you, and managing is a thing you do. And Eleanor Ashwick had spent every year of her adult life refusing to let the former swallow the latter. The letter arrived on a Thursday evening, slipped under her door like something ashamed of itself. She read it by candlelight, the brass thimble glinting at her wrist, and she read it once, and she understood it completely, and her grey-green eyes did not widen or fill or do any of the things that Honeycutt had probably imagined they would do. She took out a single sheet of paper. She dipped her pen, and she wrote, in a hand as steady as the woman who held it, "I am not a lease to be taken up, Mr. Honeycutt." She folded the letter, set it by the door to be returned in the morning, and blew out the candle. The folded letter sat by the door like a small white verdict, and Eleanor Ashwick did not look at it again. She banked the fire, what little fire there was, fed by the last quarter scuttle of coal she would permit herself until the temperature dropped below freezing proper, and she wound the ribbon at her wrist once around the brass thimble, a habit so old it had replaced prayer. Then she sat in the kitchen chair with her hands in her lap and listened to the silence of a house that belonged, for one more night at least, to her. February had teeth that year. The knock came just past 1 in the morning. Not the careful, measured knock of a man who believed he owned your time. Not the particular knock of Gerald Honeycutt with his slim, silver pocket watch and his smile that never quite committed to his eyes. This knock was ragged, desperate. The sound of knuckles that had already tried 2 other doors and found them dark. Eleanor opened it without hesitation, because that was the kind of woman she was, and the kind of woman Honeycutt would never understand, no matter how many clauses he buried in how many letters. The man on her doorstep was tall, broad-shouldered and lean beneath a plain dark coat that was soaped through at the shoulders and crusted with frost along the collar. No hat, no gloves. His dark brown hair was plastered to his forehead, curling slightly behind his ears where the ice had begun to melt, and his deep blue eyes were the particular shade of confused that belongs to a man who has been walking through freezing darkness long enough to lose his certainty about which direction is forward. A faint birthmark showed on the left side of his neck, just above where his coat collar had fallen open. His horse, she could see past his shoulder, stood steaming and miserable in the lane, favouring its left foreleg. He did not give his name. She did not ask for it. "Come inside," Eleanor said, stepping back from the door. And that was the whole of the negotiation. Now, here's the thing you need to understand. The man standing in Eleanor's kitchen, dripping snowmelt onto her flagstones, lowering himself into the chair she pulled toward the fire with hands that shook. That man was Marcus Ashford, Duke of Ashford, Master of Briarfield, owner of 40 empty bedrooms and an income of £11,000 a year. He was riding home from a surveyor's errand 3 counties over, dressed plainly because his carriage had broken an axle outside Thornbury, and he'd taken a horse rather than wait for repairs. Because waiting meant sitting still, and sitting still meant thinking. And thinking was the one activity Marcus had spent 3 years learning to avoid. He did not correct her when she glanced at his muddy boots and his clerk's coat, and treated him like what he appeared to be, a tradesman caught out by weather and bad luck. He sat at her table, and she fed him. Bread. Not fresh, 2 days old, the kind you slice thin and toast on the grate to give it one more life. Broth, reheated from a pot that had already seen its best hours. And honey. The last jar, the one Eleanor kept on the high shelf because it represented not sweetness, but currency. Every spoonful was a spoonful she could not sell, and she spooned it onto his bread without ceremony, without comment, without the faintest flicker of calculation in those steady, grey-green eyes. That meal cost her a day's wages. She served it like it cost nothing, because to Eleanor Ashwick, feeding a frozen stranger was not charity. It was fact. A man was cold, she had a fire. A man was hungry, she had bread. The arithmetic was simple, and she did not need his gratitude to make it balance. Over the meal she spoke, not much, not loudly. Her voice had the quality of a good blade, short, precise, and utterly without ornament. She mentioned the bees, 6 hives now, down from 8, because the winter had been cruel and 2 colonies had not survived. She mentioned the teaching, 3 women from the village who came twice a week to learn their letters, paying in eggs and mending when they could, paying in nothing when they couldn't. She mentioned the coal, a single scuttle per day, and that only when the temperature dropped below freezing. She described these things the way a surveyor describes a field, Not with pride, not with self-pity, with the plain precision of a woman who has measured her life down to the last shilling and found it, despite everything, sufficient. Marcus sat across from her, with his hands wrapped around a chipped cup of broth, and the thing that undid him, the thing that cracked something behind his ribs he had spent 3 years mortaring shut, was that she was not performing. She was not displaying her poverty for sympathy. She was not angling for rescue. The freckles scattered across the bridge of her nose caught the firelight, and her chestnut hair, loosened from its low knot at the nape, fell in wisps against her temples, and she looked at him with no expectation whatsoever. And it was the most terrifying thing that had happened to him since the day he inherited a dukedom and discovered that every person he had ever trusted wanted something from him that had nothing to do with who he was. He offered to pay for the meal. "No," Eleanor said. He offered to send wood. "No." He asked what he could do. And Eleanor Ashwick looked at him. This stranger, this man she believed to be a clerk or a tradesman, a man with no title and no fortune and nothing to offer her except the mild inconvenience of his frozen presence. And she said, "You can ride safely home, sir, and that will be kindness enough for one evening." The line was not cold. It was simply complete. A closed door with a light behind it. She lent him a coat, an old thing, wool, patched at the elbows. Her father's, he suspected, from the way she took it off the hook without looking at it. The way you handle an object so familiar it has stopped being a memory and become furniture. He wore it out into the dark. He did not need it. He took it because refusing would have been its own kind of insult, and for reasons he could not yet name, he would rather have frozen in the road than insult this woman. Lady Dorothea's voice found him 2 miles from home, rising unbidden from a conversation he had tried to forget. "You have mistaken recognition for pity, Marcus." He understood now. Damn him, he understood. He had recognized himself in that cottage. Not the Duke, not the title, not the signet ring heavy on his left little finger, but the version of himself that had existed before the inheritance taught him to count the cost of every kindness offered and find, always, the hidden invoice beneath it. Marcus rode home in the dark, wearing a borrowed coat he did not need, carrying the memory of a woman who fed a stranger at her own table and asked for nothing, not even his name. And for the first time in 3 years, he was not certain what kind of man he had become. Late February, the pivot. Marcus Ashford came back to Eleanor's cottage in his own carriage, the black lacquered one with the Ashford crest in gold leaf on the door, drawn by a matched pair of bays, whose combined value exceeded what most families in this parish earned in a decade. He wore his own charcoal tailcoat, his own cream waistcoat with its brass buttons catching the thin winter light, his own tall, polished boots. The heavy gold signet ring sat on his left little finger where it had always sat, where it had not sat when he'd called himself Marcus Ward and eaten bread and honey at a stranger's table. He came as himself. And Eleanor Ashwick opened her door, looked at the carriage, looked at the crest, looked at the ring, and gave him a flat, quiet expression that contained no surprise at all. Not shock, not betrayal performed for effect. Something worse, something settled. "You sat at my table," she said, her grey-green eyes steady, the brass thimble on its ribbon catching at her wrist as she folded her hands. and ate my bread under a false name. He could not deny it. That is the thing about the truth when it arrives in short, precise sentences from a woman who stands 5'3" in sturdy brown boots and does not raise her voice. It does not leave room for manoeuvring. Marcus opened his mouth, and whatever composed thing he had rehearsed in the carriage, some elegant explanation about privacy, about needing to see the parish without the distortion of rank, died before it reached his tongue. "I did," he said. She did not slam the door. She did not weep. She looked at him the way one looks at a column of figures that has finally resolved into a sum one suspected all along, and the sum is disappointing. But the debt. We need to talk about the debt, because that is what brought Marcus back in his own name. And the debt is where Gerald Honeycutt lives. Here is what Honeycutt had done. And pay attention, because this is not villainy with a dagger. This is villainy with a ledger. Patient, smiling, reasonable villainy. The kind that wears polished brown leather shoes and keeps a slim silver pocket watch on a chain and checks the time while it ruins you. Eleanor's mother had borrowed £80 against the cottage 12 years ago, when Eleanor's father died and left nothing but the house, and the debts he'd accumulated being the kind of man who believed tomorrow would be more generous than today. The original interest had been £14 per annum, manageable if one kept bees and sewed and taught and never, ever bought anything that was not strictly necessary. Eleanor had managed it. For 12 years she had managed it, paying that £14 like clockwork, and the cottage remained hers. Then Honeycutt bought the note. He'd been doing it quietly across the parish, purchasing small debts from their original holders, consolidating them, finding the obscure clauses that allowed renegotiation of terms. 7 properties, 7 families. Not dramatic seizures, arithmetic. The interest on Eleanor's debt had been raised from £14 to £40 through a clause buried so deep in the original agreement that it might as well have been written in a language no one in this parish spoke, which, functionally, it was. Legal language is its own country, and Honeycutt held the passport. £40. On a cottage worth perhaps £120, from a woman who earned, in a good year, perhaps £50 from all her labour combined. That is not lending. That is a slow closing fist. And Honeycutt, pale hazel eyes, sandy hair combed flat, that faint birthmark at the corner of his left eye, like a small stain his face could never quite wash clean. Honeycutt had smiled when he'd delivered the new terms, had checked his silver watch, had said, with the pleasant reasonableness of a man discussing weather, "I do hope you'll find the adjustment manageable, Miss Ashwick. One hates to see a woman of your industry put to unnecessary strain." One hates. As though he were not the one applying the pressure. As though the strain was something that had simply wandered in from the road. So Marcus offered to settle the debt, stood in her doorway, the crest on his carriage gleaming behind him, and said he would pay the £40, pay the entire principal if she wished, and be done with it. Eleanor refused. He offered to buy the debt himself, to hold it without interest, without terms, without pressure. She refused again. "You would own my cottage and my obligation," she said, and her voice was not angry, which made it land harder. "That is not generosity, Your Grace. That is a lease with a longer term." Your Grace. She said it the way one says a diagnosis. Lady Dorothea Bracewell had arrived that afternoon for her weekly visit. Plum shawls layered over black silk, ivory-handled cane tapping the frozen path. Pale blue eyes missing absolutely nothing. She had watched the entire confrontation from Eleanor's one good chair, her broad hands resting on the brass ferrule of that cane, her silver-white hair pinned beneath its velvet cap, her head tilted as though listening to a frequency only she could detect. After Eleanor had closed the door, not slammed, closed, which was infinitely worse, Dorothea looked at Marcus with the expression of a woman who had outlived 4 decades worth of men who believed money was a skeleton key. "She has refused you twice now," Dorothea said. "Once your food and once your money. I wonder what you will try to give her next that she will also have to refuse." That landed like a blade between the ribs. Clean, precise, final. Marcus sat alone in his study that night. The signet ring caught firelight. The room held 40 candles, burning in a house with 40 empty beds, and the silence was the kind that asks questions. He did not want to rescue Eleanor Ashwick. That was the small noise, the tiny click of a mechanism failing, the hairline fracture that, once seen, revealed the catastrophic fault running through the whole structure. His entire adult life had been built on the assumption that wealth solves, that if you could pay for it, you could fix it, that generosity was a function of scale. Eleanor had shown him that wealth, offered without understanding, is just another form of the pressure Honeycutt applies. Different hands, same fist. What Marcus wanted, and this was the pivot, the place where the story's axis shifted, was to be the kind of man she would not need to refuse. The difference is everything. And he did not yet know how to become that man, because no one had ever required it of him before. Eleanor stood in her doorway and told the Duke of Ashford, to his face, with the carriage and the crest and the signet ring in plain view, that she did not feed him because he was a duke, and she will not accept his help because he is one. "I will not be your good deed, your Grace. I have had quite enough of men who wish to own what they admire." March came in cold and grey, and the Duke of Ashford did something that not a single soul in the county predicted. He did not pay Eleanor Ashwick's debts. He did not ride to Gerald Honeycutt's office and slam a fist on the desk. He did not send a banker or a solicitor or a man with a leather case full of legal instruments. He did not do any of the grand, sweeping, duke-shaped things that a man of 11,000 a year might do when he has decided to involve himself in the life of a woman who has told him, flatly and without decoration, to keep his involvement to himself. Instead, Marcus Ashford became a customer. His housekeeper, a Mrs. Paget, stout and brisk and entirely uninterested in romantic intrigue, appeared at Eleanor's cottage door on the 2nd of March with a list. 14 sets of bed linens wanted mending. 6 pairs of curtains for the east wing needed hemming where the old stitching had given way. A tablecloth, 40 years old and fraying at every edge, required the kind of invisible repair that only a woman with a brass thimble threaded on a ribbon at her wrist and 20 years of practice could manage. The prices Mrs. Paget offered were fair, not generous, not inflated. Fair. 2 shillings 6pence per set of linens, 4 shillings per curtain, 7 shillings for the tablecloth. Real work at real wages. The kind of wages a seamstress of Eleanor's skill could expect from any household that valued craft over cheapness. And then there was the honey. 40 jars. At 2 shillings per jar, £4 even for the estate kitchen at Ashford Hall. Eleanor stood in her doorway, grey-green eyes steady, chestnut hair in its low knot, the loose wisps at her temples catching the thin March light. And she looked at Mrs. Paget's list the way a woman looks at a lock she suspects has been picked. She studied it. She turned it over. She held it up to the light of what she knew about the world, which was considerable, and she found no obvious seam where the charity had been stitched in. Because there wasn't one. That was the whole damned point. She suspected. Of course she suspected. Eleanor Ashwick had survived 9 years on her own by understanding exactly what things cost and exactly what people meant when they offered to pay more than something was worth. But the prices were not more than the work was worth. The work was real. The linens genuinely needed mending. She could see that for herself when the first bundle arrived, frayed and thin and smelling of lavender sachets that had long since lost their scent. And she could not refuse honest trade without becoming the kind of proud fool who starves on principle. And Eleanor had never been a fool. She accepted. But she watched. The orders came through Mrs. Paget. Always Mrs. Paget, never the Duke. His name did not appear on a single invoice. His carriage did not roll up the lane. His signet ring, that heavy gold thing on his left little finger, cast no shadow over her threshold. He simply became a name she did not see, attached to money she could not reasonably refuse, for work she was genuinely good at. Lord Henry Cavell, leaning against the mantel at Ashford Hall, with his battered riding crop tucked under one arm and his auburn hair in its usual state of cheerful disorder, was the first to say it aloud. "You are courting her with invoices." Marcus, standing military straight by the window with his hands clasped behind his back, did not turn. "I am not courting her. I am buying honey." "You have purchased 40 jars of honey for a household of 12 servants, Marcus." 12. That is more than 3 jars per person. You are courting her. The Duke said nothing, which was itself a kind of confession. Now, while Marcus was busy not courting Eleanor Ashwick with linen commissions and wildflower honey, Gerald Honeycutt, that slim, patient, smiling son of a bitch, was busy doing what Gerald Honeycutt did best: tightening the vice. He arrived at Eleanor's cottage on a Tuesday afternoon in mid-March. He wore his dove-grey waistcoat, his polished brown shoes, his composed and careful stillness. His slim silver pocket watch caught the light as he drew it from his pocket, checked the hour and tucked it away again, a gesture that said, more clearly than words, that Eleanor's time was a thing he was choosing to spend his own upon. His pale, hazel eyes settled on her with that particular quality of patient attention that a cat gives a mouse it has already cornered, but is not yet hungry enough to eat. He sat across from her in her own cottage, in the chair she had mended herself, and he laid out his final offer with the careful precision of a man arranging knives on a table. Marriage. To him. The debts would vanish, the cottage would be secured, Her situation, he used that word, situation, as though her entire life were a problem in arithmetic, would be resolved. He framed every sentence as rescue, as generosity, as the reasonable conclusion that any sensible woman would reach if she would only stop being difficult. Eleanor heard the cage door in every word. She did not shout. She did not stand. She did not reach for outrage, because outrage would have given him something to hold, proof that she was emotional, irrational, a woman who needed steadying. Instead, she set down her teacup. No tremor, no clink of porcelain against saucer, just the quiet, deliberate placement of a cup by a woman who has decided exactly what she is going to say. I would sooner keep bees in a ditch, Mr. Honeycutt, than keep house for a man who mistakes ownership for affection. Honeycutt left, with the smile still on his face, but his hands were shaking. That evening, when Eleanor recounted the exchange to Lady Dorothea Bracewell, who sat in her usual chair with her ivory-handled cane resting beneath her palm, her sharp, pale blue eyes bright beneath that plum velvet cap, the old woman did something unexpected. She laughed. A real laugh, rare and startling, rising from somewhere deep in her stout frame. "You have just made an enemy, my dear." Dorothea's silver-white hair caught the firelight as she leaned forward. "But you have also made yourself impossible to pity, which is far more dangerous to a man like Honeycutt than any enemy could be." Late March, and the man moved fast. Give him that much. Gerald Honeycutt was never slow when he smelled blood. 3 days after Eleanor set down that teacup without a tremor and told him she'd sooner keep bees in a ditch, he filed his claim through the county court. Not a letter this time. Not a visit with that slim, silver pocket watch catching the light while he smiled his way through another threat dressed as concern. No, a formal filing, stamped and dated, citing accumulated debt and failure to meet revised terms. The hearing was set for April, and the numbers, when you laid them out, were a kind of portrait of the man. The original debt was £14. 14. Eleanor's mother had borrowed it during a bad winter when the roof needed mending and the coal ran low, and she had signed a note with Honeycutt's father, a simpler man, by all accounts, who charged fair interest and expected repayment in kind. But Gerald had inherited that note along with everything else, and Gerald had added a compounding clause. Then he'd recalculated the interest. Then he'd revised the terms and sent Eleanor a letter informing her that the new balance was £40, payable in full by quarter day. And if she could not pay, well, he would be forced, with great reluctance, to pursue the matter through the courts. £40 from 14 for a cottage and a quarter-acre of land worth 200. And the filing fee? He absorbed it himself, didn't even blink, because the filing fee was nothing to a man like Honeycutt. It was the cost of doing business, the price of patience, the small investment a spider makes in silk. He had waited years for this. He had watched Eleanor's mother die and Eleanor take over the sewing and the bees and the garden, and he had watched her refuse him twice, and he had smiled each time, because Gerald Honeycutt understood something about poverty that most comfortable people never bother to learn. It has a season. You wait long enough, press gently enough, and the fruit falls. Eleanor had £3 and a shelf of honey jars. That was the whole of her arsenal. Now, Marcus. Here is where it gets interesting. Because what Marcus did was not what you'd expect a duke to do. A duke with 12,000 a year and a house with 40 empty beds could have paid the debt in the time it takes to sign his name. Could have sent a man with a bank draft and been done with it before breakfast. And the old Marcus, the one who believed that money was the answer to every question because money had never failed to answer his, might have done exactly that. He didn't. Instead, he sent for his own solicitor, a man named Phelps, grey-haired and meticulous, who arrived from London with 2 leather cases and a pair of spectacles he kept pushing up his nose. And Marcus set Phelps to work, not on the debt, but on the documents. Every document Honeycutt had filed, every clause, every signature, every date. What Phelps found took him less than a week. The revised interest clause, the one that turned £14 into 40, had never been signed by Eleanor's mother. Honeycutt had drafted it, dated it, and filed it as though it were agreed upon. But the signature line was blank. Just blank. The man had been so certain of his own inevitability that he hadn't even bothered to forge it. But that wasn't the thing that mattered most. The thing that mattered most was buried in the original deed, in a bequest clause written by Eleanor's grandmother, a woman named Anne Hartley, who had owned the cottage outright, and who had, with the careful foresight of a woman who understood exactly what men like Honeycutt do to women like her granddaughter, written a single sentence into the transfer of property that Honeycutt had either missed or ignored. The hearing was brief. Honeycutt arrived composed, as he always arrived, that slim silver watch chain catching the light, those pale hazel eyes steady, that smile that never quite reached them. He sat with his hands flat on the table, perfectly still, perfectly patient, perfectly certain. Marcus's solicitor stood and presented the original deed. The clause was read aloud, and the room went quiet the way rooms go quiet when something true enters them. To my granddaughter and her heirs, this house and the ground it stands upon, free of lien and obligation, in perpetuity. Free of lien, in perpetuity. Honeycutt's smile did not change. That was the remarkable thing. The smile stayed exactly where it was, fixed and pleasant and perfectly composed, while his hands rose slowly from the table and pressed against his forehead, as though he were trying to hold something inside his skull that wanted very badly to come out. He was not defeated by force. No one struck him. No one shouted. He was simply made irrelevant. The debt was real, £14, honestly owed, and Eleanor would pay it in time, as she paid everything, slowly and completely, and without asking anyone's help. But the claim against the cottage was nothing, had always been nothing. A patient man's long game, undone by a dead woman's single sentence. And Eleanor, standing in that hearing room with her dove-grey wool dress and the brass thimble threaded on its ribbon at her wrist, her chestnut hair in its low knot, her grey-green eyes steady, Eleanor learned what Marcus had done. Not the payment. There had been no payment. He had not bought her freedom. He had found the proof that she had always been free. The distinction is everything. In the corridor outside the hearing room, Marcus caught Eleanor's arm, the first time he had touched her, and said, "I did not do this for you." His hand on her sleeve, his deep blue eyes, his square jaw, that faint birthmark on the left side of his neck, just above the collar, the gold signet ring on his left little finger, pressing lightly against the worn wool of her dress. Eleanor looked at his hand on her sleeve, then at his face, and said, "I know. That is the only reason I have not asked you to leave." They stood like that for a breath too long, close enough to feel the warmth between them, still enough that the silence held its own weight. And then she withdrew her arm and walked out into the spring air alone. April. The cottage is Eleanor's. The bees are waking, and Marcus has stopped telling anyone why Eleanor Ashwick is wrong for him, because he has finally understood that she was never wrong for him. He was wrong for himself. He comes on a Tuesday. No carriage, no crest on the door. He walks because a carriage would be a statement, and he has made enough statements about Eleanor Ashwick to last 3 lifetimes. Every last one of them a lie, he told himself, so he could sleep at night in a house with 40 empty beds. The dark charcoal tailcoat is gone. He wears the plain coat, the one he wore the night she fed him at her own table without knowing his name, and the gold signet ring on his left little finger catches the morning light as he lifts his hand to knock, and then lowers it, and then lifts it again, because Marcus Ashford, Duke of Ashford, £11,000 a year, master of an estate that could swallow this cottage and its garden and its hives without noticing the loss. Marcus Ashford is afraid of a door. He knocks. She opens it. The dove-grey wool dress, the brass thimble on its ribbon at her wrist, those steady grey-green eyes that have never once looked at him the way the world looks at him, which is to say, they have never calculated his worth before deciding whether to see him. He does not propose. He apologizes. For the false name at her table, for the presumption of the money left on Honeycutt's desk, like she was a debt to be settled. For every conversation in a drawing room or a dining hall or a corridor where he described her to others as insufficient, too quiet, too plain, too proud, too ordinary to be worth the trouble of a second glance. He says each thing plainly, without ornament, without asking her to forgive any of it. And when he is finished, he turns to leave. Eleanor's voice stops him at the garden gate. "You are asking me to believe," she says, and her tone is the tone of a woman who has mended her own roof and buried her own dead and answered to no one for 7 years. That a man who spent 3 months telling his friends I was too quiet has suddenly discovered that quiet suits him. "I will not be a curiosity, Your Grace. I will not be the story you tell at supper about how you surprised everyone." That line landed like a door slamming shut on every finger he owned. She was not angry. She was precise. She was telling him, in terms so clear that even a duke could understand them, that she would be chosen as herself or not at all. That she would not be the charming twist in someone else's narrative, the poor girl who turned out to be interesting after all, the surprise ending to a season's worth of boredom. She had built a life, bees, bread, a garden, a chair she mended with her own hands, and that life was real and whole and hers, and she would not trade it for the privilege of being someone's revelation. Marcus turned back. His hands were clasped behind him in that military straight posture, chin elevated, every inch the Duke. And then the composure cracked. the way a frozen river cracks in spring, not all at once, but in long, jagged lines that run faster than you can follow. I am not asking you to be anything. I am telling you. No, I am asking. He stopped, swallowed, started again with the rawness of a man who has never in his life been permitted to be inarticulate. You are the only person who has spoken to me as though I were merely a man in 3 years. And I would rather be merely a man in your kitchen than a duke in every room I own. The line broke because she had unsettled him, and he could not perform composure in front of the one person who had never required it. Eleanor did not say yes. Let that sit for a moment. She did not say yes. She said, "Then come back tomorrow, and the day after, and bring no ring, and no deed, and no carriage. Come as the man who sat at my table. That man I would like to know better." Not acceptance, an invitation to begin. So he came back, tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that. Marcus at Eleanor's table, in plain clothes, eating bread and honey from her own hives, learning the difference between a worker and a drone, getting stung twice on the left hand and once on the jaw, and refusing to complain because complaining would be the act of a man who expected the world to be gentle with him, and he was trying very hard to be a man who expected nothing. Eleanor laughed once, at something he said about the bees having better governance than Parliament, and the sound undid him so completely that he set down his bread and simply looked at her. This woman of 29 and 20, with the chestnut hair in its low knot, and the freckles across her nose, and the birthmark below her right ear, and understood that he had spent his entire life acquiring things that could not refuse him, and that the only thing worth having was a living woman who could say no and might yet say yes. Lady Dorothea Bracewell watched all of this from her chair by the window, the ivory-handled cane resting under one palm, the pale blue eyes sharp and watchful beneath that plum velvet cap. She said nothing, which was, from Dorothea, the loudest approval she had ever given. The wedding was in spring, small, parish church. No title on the invitation. Eleanor wore her grey dress. Marcus wore the plain coat. Dorothea attended in all 3 shawls and told the assembly, in a voice that carried to the back pew and beyond, "I have waited 50 years for someone in this family to marry a woman who could mend a chair. You are all welcome for my patience." Honeycutt was not there. Honeycutt was in no position to be anywhere that mattered, his slim silver pocket watch ticking away the hours in a life that had become very quiet and very small. Because when you use money as a whip, eventually the hand holding it runs out of people willing to stand still. And years later, because the ending must be earned by years, not moments, 2 greying heads bent over a beekeeper's ledger in the estate garden, the brass thimble still on its ribbon at Eleanor's wrist, the gold signet ring on his little finger, a mended chair beside the kitchen table where a duke once sat as a stranger and was fed without being asked his name. The hives hummed, the garden grew. The hard years were not erased, they were simply no longer the whole of the story.